Arps are amazing. Let's have a look at them today. So hopefully you guys remember this project. This is the project in which we also did the one-shots and I've talked about the wavetable basslines in this one as well. And in this part of the project over here, we have this amazing Arp. As you can hear, it's a very strong element and it's very memorable as well. And that's really the whole idea behind an Arp. It's an element that stands out in the track. Because it's a melodic element, it will get stuck in your head, and because it has that repeating factor to it as well, it's easier to memorize. And then of course we're using a whole bunch of different automations and extra effects to make it sound more interesting. But today I mainly want to look into the general concept of Arps. I am going to show a little bit of sound design, particularly with this patch over here. But I also want to show you some other techniques that you can use to actually implement Arps and how you can use them in your track. Now, one of the ways that I'm getting this Arp to work is to make sure that I'm just using it in a small part of the track. That way, that part of the track is actually going to stand out, and you won't actually become bored of the element because you're not playing it too much. As you can hear before it, we have this very drippy, psychedelic kind of sound. You can also hear some grid synths which repeat over here as well. So there's a little bit of overlap between support elements. And then in the next section, we also hear a very gritty lead, a very textured lead, but you can see the support elements for that lead also change. So just looking a little bit further into the musical idea itself, what we'll see is that it's just a MIDI like this. And this is one of the ways that you can make your Arp. You can just write it into MIDI. Now, I'm not very good at music theory, but I'm going to try to do my best to actually explain what's going on here. When it comes to the melody, you can see it's basically made up of two components in this case. We have our top melody over here. And then we have our supporting melody down below over here. As you can see, one of the things that I immediately do when I'm writing my Arps is that I divide it up into the support melody also by velocity over here. So if I move this up, you can see that the support melody is lower in velocity and then all of these high notes are higher in velocity. Now in this particular case, in the Arp patch itself, if we quickly go into there, you can see that I'm not actually using that velocity. It isn't assigned to anything. But if I want to do so in the future, then this is a great way of already having that set up, and I don't have to go back into the MIDI to actually change that. I can just go into here and set up the velocity somewhat like this. And now you can hear that we have velocity control and that support melody isn't coming through as much as the main melody does. Now in this case, I just like to keep it normal, but at least I have the velocity already set up. So if it's normal, it sounds like this. As you can hear, it just feels a lot more connected this way, and in my opinion, this is a better setup for this particular sound. But moving back into the MIDI, what you'll see is that the support melody isn't really a melody and that it just plays root notes in 2 octaves over here. And then the real melodic interest sits in the main melody up top over here. What you'll also see is that for the support MIDI, when we take one bar and we duplicate it over, it is exactly the same notes in the next bar, and so on and so on. Which means that the rhythm of these notes over here are also consistent throughout bars because all of the notes have been used here. When it comes to the repetition, the main melody actually repeats twice. As you can see over here, if I duplicate it over 2 bars, you see that the second part is a copy of the first part. So just quickly looking at the sound design, you'll see that the sound is actually fairly simple. We just have a saw wave with 4 voices of unison and a little bit of detune over here. And then this LFO is controlling this high pass over here, which repeats every 4 bars. This is just to give it a little bit of initial filter movement, because later on we do go through the phaser over here, which is what the main movement of the sound is coming from. And as you can see, this is set to repeat every 16 bars over here. And this phaser is just nicely modulating through the frequency spectrum, which we're then pushing out with this tube distortion over here, being controlled by this envelope. And then we have this multiband compressor together with this EQ to further shape the spectrum. This of course also tackles some of the dynamics of the sounds, but that is something that I'll usually look into when it comes to the mixing stage. And as you can see, this project is still in early production stage. And then in terms of the effects that I have on top of it right now in the production, it is just delay and reverb and a little bit of EQ. As you can see, what this EQ is mainly doing is removing some of the lowest frequencies that I'm sure to not need. I'm leaving a lot of space open. Again, this is not the mixing stage yet, so I'm leaving myself a lot of room to work with here. But of course, anything below like 50 Hz is something that we'll never need. What I don't want to do and what I see a lot of people do is immediately move this up to maybe 100 Hz or maybe even 150. In my opinion, that's not a good idea, so I leave this at like 55, so that when it comes to the mixing stage, I have a lot of space to work with. And if I then feel that I need to cut out more, I can still do that. But I'll always have those frequencies present if I need them as well. But what you'll then see is that for the ARP, both the high pass and the low pass are being automated at some point. Here in the fill, the high pass is just used to remove it and make the frequency spectrum kind of sweep up. And then you can see for the low pass, it is initially coming in ever so slightly. You can see it kind of moving up like that and kind of with the resonance bumping up the highest point of where the highest frequency is going to be. And then in the fill as well, it just goes down and then back up again, so that it kind of helps with completing the sweep over here. And that's just a nice way to kind of round out the ARP and make it nicely transition into the next segment. Now there's other ways that you can write ARPs. Let's have a look at this example over here. This is just a preset from my recent Vital pack, which by the way is currently on sale until the 5th of May. So if you're interested in the sound that you're about to hear, as well as 93 other presets, make sure to go check that out on my Gumroad page. Now what you'll see that I've done over here is I've basically written the ARP inside of the LFOs over here. We have one LFO over here, and then we have this other LFO over here, which is set to a quarter note instead of the half notes that it's on by default. And what is going on is that all of these are transpositioning up the semitones over here by 12, so that you essentially have a 1 octave range that you can work with. And just by painting in steps over here, you essentially have control over which notes that you're going to be playing, because this is an octave and we have set it to 12. Essentially, each step is going to end up being a semitone extra of modulation. Now, what you can do is you can just stop here. You can make one LFO and assign that as the semitones to each one over here. But there's a cooler technique that you can do where you have these alternating LFOs. And as you can see, what I'm doing is I've also set this up in the same way, in that it modulates it up 12 semitones. But I don't want to go up 24 semitones every time. So what we're doing is we're using this LFO over here to control when this LFO is being applied to the modulation, as opposed to this one. Now there's a lot going on in terms of the modulations in this patch, and I'm not going to go over all of it. But you can see the main idea sketched out over here, in that both LFO1 and LFO2 control the oscillator 1 transpose over here. We also have it set up for the oscillator 2 transpose later down below, as well for oscillator 3 somewhere. So for now, we're just going to focus on oscillator 1, and then you can copy this idea over to other oscillators. But as you can see, LFO3 over here is controlling both of these modulations over here. And you can see that when we look at the graph over here, one is flipped upside down. So that means essentially that if the modulation is low, one of these modulations is going to play, in this case, the one for LFO1. And if it goes up high like we do over here in the last part, it is actually going to switch to the other modulation. It's going to let that through. And instead, LFO2 is going to be responsible for the pitch modulation. Now there's another LFO that is controlling the pitch over here. As you can see, we have this LFO6 over here as well, and this is the same idea. This one will be stacking on top of LFO2 over here. So here that there's a repetition over here for a quarter note, but it's not actually playing a quarter note, because in the second part, this note is being tuned up an extra 3 semitones. You can hear that one extra note from the Frisian scale being put on top there at the end of the 2-bar repetition. And that is just another way that you can keep an ARP interesting. Now sometimes you just find a cool ARP and then you have a platform that you can jump off from and that you can experiment with. So in this particular case, I found this ARP over here inside of Omnisphere. Now, as you can see, we have a whole bunch of automations over here, together with a layer that also has the same amount of automations, as you can see over here. We get this really cool full ARP sound. And once you have an idea like that, you can build on top of it with extra synths, supporting elements and other elements, and then you can get something like this. And the cool thing is this isn't really the same kind of ARP as we saw in the last one. In reality, what is happening over here is that the ARP patch usually plays multiple notes and arpeggiates between them if you play chords. But since we're using just one note at the time, what we essentially get is we just get this repeating sequence of the same notes over and over again. And in this case, it's just playing a 16-note pattern. But as you can hear, this is still a very cool and effective way to make an ARP, and it just gives a little bit of a different feeling because it's more based around the chords that you play. Even though the bass line below it isn't changing, it still has this very nice kind of chord structure to it. And because by the time the kick and bass comes in, this ARP is already playing, we essentially are already used to the idea of the chords changing, and then we just have this solid bass line underneath, which just gives the track a little bit more stability. So this is just a little bit of a different musical idea, but you can see that it's still based around ARPs. And this is just a really good example of having a starting off point, having that one patch that gives you this inspiration, this idea. And then just taking that and building upon it with a whole bunch of other elements. All of these elements over here build on top of it. As well as what is happening over here. This is just a vocal pad that is also repeating the same melody as you can see. So overall, in my opinion, a very cool way to start writing a track. Now the cool thing is, within the same project, I'm also using somewhat of a similar idea to what we saw in the last project. So you have this ARP over here. That transforms again with the phaser into something that sounds like this. And the cool thing, as you can imagine, is that we have two different memorable sounds that each have their own melody and that are separated quite far in terms of the idea. As you can see, our other idea was over here. And this idea is all the way over here, so this is for the final drop. And there has been a lot of different things in between that, including some glitchy synths, including a different acid line as well in here. A progressive bass line as well.
And can provide for everyone the way of life.
So what you can really do with these ARPs when it comes to musical ideas is that you can separate it in two or even multiple different melodic ideas. Technically, I would also count this acid line over here as a melodic idea. So essentially we have three different melodic ideas in this particular project. And around that, I'm obviously building with glitchy synths and other sound design as well. But you can imagine that the track becomes really memorable if you write like this, where you have a main ARP, where you have a main idea that really comes through, that really stands out. And this does not necessarily have to be an ARP. Of course, you can do some really cool stuff with sound design as well if you find a particular sound that is very interesting in terms of sound design. I've personally just found that this is a very easy way to do it. So this is something that I'll definitely use in the future as well, because I really do like writing my tracks like this. The final thing that I want to show you today is this idea over here. What you'll see that I've done over here is that I've taken this MIDI over here. This is a 1-bar repeating ARP over here. As you can see, this is just played in MIDI notes. And as you can duplicate it over, you can see that it's essentially the same thing repeating. And I've written it in such a way that it kind of rises up like this. Now this was written in a very specific way that I'm going to go into in another video. But I did this with Stepic, which I also want to highlight in a little bit. But the main idea is that I had Stepic play out this ARP over here. I just randomly generated ARPs until I found something that fit. And then using different MIDI effects, mainly the MIDI effects, the pitch over here, and then the scale as well, which is this one over here. I was able to essentially every bar or every half a bar over here towards the end, pitch it up ever so slightly more, while keeping it in the scale of the track. Meaning that we had this generative ARP going in here, and every time the ARP would be pushed a little bit up, and then it would be kind of corrected with the scale over here. And that is how the rising effect inside of this melody is created, as opposed to just your standard kind of pitch bends that you would normally see in a build-up. This way of doing it is a little bit more harmonious. Of course, you could also just write out something like this, and I'll probably have to get back into it and write out a little bit more, because I'm not entirely happy yet with how it's exactly sounding, but that's something that I'll have to look into later. As I said, the last thing that I want to showcase is just Stepic. I just quickly want to shout it out. I've done many videos on it before. This is it over here. This is a Max for Life device, and it's very, very easy to use. I'm not going to go in depth into how to use this, because I've, as I said, done videos on it in the past, so I'll just link to those. But essentially, this is a whole platform that allows you to write in different parts of your ARP. You can see that we have the overall notes over here. You can set scales, you can set the length, you can set multiple patterns and automatically switch between them if you want to. There's a whole automation section over here if you in tandem want to automate some parameters with your ARP. And then you can see you have control over the octaves, you have control over the duration of the note, the velocity of the notes, the swing between all of the notes. And then divider and note repeat also allows you to divide up the note and play it multiple times. There's even a whole chord section in here where you can have it play chords as well. And there's also ways that you can set this up so that it plays a drum machine as well. So it's a very, very powerful tool for this kind of thing, but the main power really comes in the randomization options that it has. As you can see, you can basically randomize anything that you want. And you can even set it to just generate random notes or generate randomness in particular parts. There's actually multiple different randomization options over here, multiple different randomization ways you can see over here as well. You can randomize these things. Basically anything that you can see can either be randomized over here as well as just randomized per step. So as you can imagine, it's just massively powerful, and it really allows you to quickly generate cool sounding ideas that you wouldn't have come up with yourself. In this particular case, what I eventually decided to do is record that idea into MIDI, as I said, but you don't have to do that either, because Stepic is also able to be played via MIDI. So you can send MIDI notes in, and then it will basically arpeggiate those MIDI notes for you, or play the arpeggio when the MIDI is playing, stuff like that. And I believe you can also set up MIDI triggers for the different patterns over here as well, if you don't want to use the automatic switching between patterns. And really, Stepic is not the only option for this, but I found it the most useful out of all of the ones that I've tried. Another very good one though is just the basic arpeggio that you get in here. If you just want a very simple arpeggiator, you can just use the arpeggiator inside of Ableton. And I know for a fact that other DAWs will have similar tools as well. I know for a fact that FL Studio has a very powerful arpeggiator built into the piano roll. It allows you to generate arpeggios within MIDI inside of the piano roll itself. And there's also many more plugins and other tools available that allow you just to create arpeggiators. And even just certain parts of that, maybe you have a chord generator and then you have another tool that actually splices up those chords into arpeggiators. So you can combine different plugins and effects like that. And generally, this is the part where you really get into experimentation and you get to find your own tools that you find useful for this kind of thing. If there is an interesting way in which you are generating ARPs, I would love to hear about that, so you can leave a comment down below if you know about something. But that's going to be it for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. Make sure to check out my Gumroad sale, of course. Another way to support the channel is to continue watching some of my videos, so there will be 2 up on the screen right now. One is my latest tutorial, another will be recommended to you by YouTube. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.